Lesson 43, the American Revolution and Europe. So the American Revolution is of global importance, and really important to study even in AP European history as opposed to AP US history. And this might help you next year when you take the AP US history to pay attention to this stuff. The American Revolution was the result of the revenue problems Britain shared with other powers. It was also part of the rivalry between the French and the British, and increased French financial problems caused by them helping out the Americans in the American Revolution will help lead to the French Revolution. So this American Revolution is a pretty big deal. So a big theme to why the American Revolution happens is resistance to the imperial search for revenue. There are two British problems after the Treaty of Paris in 1763: the cost of maintaining their empire and vast new territories to organize. So the cost of maintaining the empire, their debts were rising as a result of all these wars they're fighting. So one of the things that had risen also is domestic taxation. In other words, they had increased taxes on British people to pay for these wars. And they felt American colonists, who they felt like had benefited the most from the war because of all this new territory, and because they were protected from the French, from the British perspective, they felt like American colonists should help pay for the cost of the war and for this new territory. What new territory? Well, these new territories included the St. Lawrence River Valley and the Mississippi Valley, and one of the things that had to be dealt with is you have a new French-speaking population within British control, and you also have Native Americans who live there, and you have got to figure out what you're going to do with them. So the British start trying to find a way to raise revenues in 1764 with Prime Minister Grenville's Sugar Act. What this did is it actually lowered the tax on sugar, but they rigorously enforced it, which they hadn't been doing much before. So smugglers also would be tried in admiralty courts without juries. This is one of the things that's going to bother Americans because of the idea that, hey, we want a right to a trial by jury and things like that. This is going to bug them. And just generally speaking, it's a tax. They don't like taxes. 1765 Stamp Act on legal documents and other items, including newspapers, would be passed. I bet everybody's familiar with the Stamp Act from grade school. Included playing cards. I bet you remember that, seeing that. And acts were approved by Parliament for these kinds of things. The money was to be spent in the colonies, and so from the British perspective, this was okay, because after all, we are raising taxes on you, but it's to cover costs that we're dealing with where you live. But that's not how the Americans would look at it. The Americans would look at it as a lack of representation. So here's the American response. Americans argued that only colonial assemblies had the right to tax colonists. Colonists felt that they were not represented in Parliament, and they were also afraid that revenue raised outside of the colonies could be spent outside of the colonies. So one of the Americans' arguments was simply that, well, just because you're going to spend it here now doesn't mean you'll continue to spend it here. If you take it from us, you might decide to spend it somewhere else later down the road. So October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress. There's a protest by colonies. There's disorder in the colonies, especially in Massachusetts, thanks to the leadership in Massachusetts of the Sons of Liberty. One of the big leaders of the Sons of Liberty is a guy by the name of Samuel Adams. You guys might know more because of a beverage and commercials than anything else. He is a cousin to John Adams, second president of the United States. The colonists agreed to boycott British goods, which means they're going to stop buying a lot of British goods, which is going to hurt the British economy. So the British, in 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed, but they pass a declaratory act stating that Parliament's power includes the power to legislate for the colonies. So they're saying, okay, fine, we'll give up on the Stamp Act, but hey, we're passing an act that says we get to make laws for you whether you like it or not. So the pattern is set. Parliament will pass an act to increase control or to increase revenue, in the colonies. Colonists will debate, protest, boycott, and riot over this new act, whichever kind of act it is. Parliament will then back down and repeal the act, but then Parliament would then pass another act, and the cycle would continue. With each clash, tension increased, and Americans more fully developed their own ideas on political liberty. So there's a cycle here going on. An act gets passed, ticks off the Americans, Americans protest, the British back off of it, then they pass another act that's even more strict, and it starts up again. So the crisis in independence. In 1767, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Charles Townshend, urged passage of a series of acts. He's basically like the finance minister of Britain. So here are the acts. There's an act on imports resisted by colonists. So they're trying to control importation. The British sent in their own customs agents to enforce the laws. They sent troops into Boston in 1768 to protect customs agents. In March 1770, you've got some American colonists who start throwing bricks and rocks at soldiers. So you have the Boston Massacre, where the British soldiers shoot on this mob that's trying to hurt them. And all the Townshend duties but the tea duty is repealed. So all of these duties on imports that the colonists are resisting get repealed except the tea duty. The duty is basically a tax on imports. In May 1773, a new law allowing the East India Company to directly import tea to colonies is established. This is going to lower the price of tea even with the tax, but it's going to cut out the American shippers. So people like John Hancock, who was the largest shipping merchant in the colonies at the time of the American Revolution. Probably news to some of you. Some cities will actually refuse to allow the tea to be unloaded. In Boston, they go a little further than that, though. The Sons of Liberty dress up like Native Americans. And guys, they don't do it like to be convincing. They just dress up enough to where they can claim they were in disguise, and the people of Boston could pretend that they didn't recognize anybody because they're all disguised as Native Americans. You know, obviously people knew better. And they get on board the ship, they take the tea, and they dump it in the harbor. They dump what is the equivalent of today millions of dollars worth of tea. Okay, so it's a really big deal. So Prime Minister Lord North in Parliament will pass the Intolerable Acts in 1774 as a response to this protest. They closed the port of Boston, so no merchant shipping going in and out of Boston. That's going to hurt Boston a lot. They reorganized the Massachusetts state government, well actually the colony, Massachusetts colony's government. They quarter troops in homes, and they decide that trials of customs agents will only happen in English courts, partly because some customs agents were getting trumped up charges against them by the Americans. So it's not like the Americans were the nicest, sweetest people in this situation. You got to remember they were tarring and feathering some of these customs agents. When I say tarring and feathering, it wasn't a pleasant experience. That tar was extremely hot. And they often were tarred and feathered after they were beaten up. So in 1774, the Quebec Act gave Ohio Valley to Quebec, which, the colonists at this point had formed the committees of correspondence. They organized the First Continental Congress in September 1774 in Philadelphia. And they're going to be upset about this because this means that it's essentially trying to close off settlement by the colonists in the Ohio River Valley and open it up for some other portion of the British Empire. They're going to ask Parliament to change their mind, but while they're asking Parliament to change their mind, this is happening. The shots heard around the world. The start of revolution, as Schoolhouse Rock would put it. April 1775, you have the battles of Lexington and Concord. In June 1775, you have the colonial defeat at the Battle of Bunker Hill that didn't go too well for Americans. May 1775, you have the Second Continental Congress. They're still hoping for a reconciliation with England. They're acting as a government. But in August 1775, George III declares the colonies in rebellion. By the winter of 1775, Thomas Paine has issued his pamphlet, Common Sense, which has roused public opinion against Britain and stirred people up, getting people ready for a big war. A colonial army and navy has been organized. In April 1776, the Continental Congress will open the ports in the colonies to all nations. So, of course, remember the mercantile system means that Britain, as long as these are British colonies, they're trying to keep the ports where they only get to trade with Mother England. So this is a big deal. July 4th, 1776, the Declaration of Independence is adopted. In 1778, Franklin is able to secure French support, and in 1779, Spain allies with the Americans as well. So you can see how this falls into European and global politics. Old French and Spanish rivalries with the British will play into this. It's very important that the Americans get French support, especially. And the reason why we're able to get so much support is because we start winning military victories. The big battle in New York that George Washington wins will lead to support from European powers. The revolution will continue until 1781. Washington's army and a French fleet, and by the way, a significant portion of Washington's army was French to boot. So you have basically a French and colonial army, and you have a French fleet defeating the English Cornwallis at Yorktown. So this is a different kind of perspective than you usually get about what happened in the American Revolution. 1783, the Treaty of Paris made American independence official. American political ideas. Origins of American political ideas are mainly from the English Civil War. The Americans saw the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights as securing their own rights, and they believed British policy from 1763 onward were attacks on their liberty. And we'll go into more detail about those ideas in just a second. They used John Locke's idea, which was developed to justify an aristocratic revolution, to justify a colonial revolution. So John Locke was part of the Whig Party in Britain. These Whig ideas were not the only ideas that they were interested in. This is really interesting to me. I hope you pay attention to this. The Commonwealth men, these were political thinkers who advocated republicanism and were influenced by radical Puritan thinking from the English Civil War. Now these guys, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, wrote the Cato's Letters, which criticized patronage, and the guy who was the minister at the time, Sir Robert Walpole. They viewed taxation as financing political corruption. And guys, think about the Tea Party movement today and think about the Commonwealth men. They viewed taxation as financing political corruption. They viewed standing armies as tools of tyrants. So this might sound familiar. And these are views that really aren't views from John Locke. These are views that aren't from Baron Montesquieu or Voltaire or these other Enlightenment thinkers. These are views held by this group, John Trenchard, Thomas Gordon, that you don't usually hear about. So if you learn this, you've got a little nugget of information that most people don't know about America. Now, the Commonwealth men had very little influence in Britain because the British people didn't view themselves as being controlled by British tyrants. These guys are kind of, on the extremes in Britain at the time. But Americans did not know how British people felt about government in Britain because they weren't in Britain. So they took these books at face value and assumed that government in Britain was more tyrannical to British than apparently the British thought it was. And they found Cato's letters to be very convincing. So now we move to events in Great Britain. George III, he's the guy who is the king during the American Revolution. He felt the Whigs and ministers in Britain had bullied his father and his grandfather. So he appoints the Earl of Bute to be his new prime minister, ignoring Whig families, and he uses patronage, like Sir Robert Walpole, to try to control the House of Commons. So he's trying to exert more royal authority. He tries one minister after another, and it's not working out, and then he finally appoints Lord North, and Lord North is able to exercise some authority. The Whigs claim George III tried to impose tyranny, and again, this is going to play into the ears of the colonists a lot more than it's going to play into the ears of the British people. Now you get another scandal in England that, from the American perspective, the challenge of John Wilkes. In 1763, a London radical and member of Parliament, that's what MP stands for, is member of Parliament, published a paper called the North Briton. And in the 45th issue, he criticizes the Earl of Bute's peace talks with France. He gets arrested, but he maintains his rights as a member of Parliament, so he gets released. In other words, as a member of Parliament, he gets to talk about things and argue about political ideas in a way that a regular British person at the time couldn't. The House of Commons ruled that the North Briton, his paper, was libelous, so they expel Wilkes. Wilkes flees the country. He's outlawed, but he has a great deal of popular support in Britain. So in 1768, he returns. He gets re-elected. The House of Commons refuses to seat him. He gets elected 3 more times, and he still is ignored. And a slogan pops up for him called Wilkes and Liberty. He finally gets seated in 1774 after he becomes the Lord Mayor of London. So this should tell you he's really popular, even though he's, critical of the regime. So the Wilkes affair is really going to play into American fears about British government. It will confirm colonial fear about monarchy. The Whigs will describe the king as a tyrant. So in the minds of the colonies, the king's power is being used arbitrarily. The House of Commons appears to be corrupt. After all, you have this guy who's been elected by the people, from the as far as colonists are concerned, and they're not letting him represent the people. So this is the same king in Parliament who will occupy Boston and deny colonists a right to a jury trial. So you take in the side that they bought into the ideas of the Commonwealth men, and then you see the actions of the British government concerning John Wilkes, and the actions of the British government concerning how they deal with the Boston Tea Party. Now the movement for parliamentary reform. British subjects at home were no more directly represented than Americans. A lot of people don't seem to understand that. Wilkes and Americans both were protesting a largely self-elected, aristocratic political body. American colonists demonstrated how revolutionaries could create orderly political bodies that function outside the establishment through congresses and conventions. So this is going to have some effect in England. And remember, the American assemblies are going to be legitimate because of popular consent, not because of an aristocracy or some sort of tradition. Now you're going to get the Yorkshire Association movement in Britain as well. Many in Britain resented the mismanagement of the American Revolution, the high taxes that paid for it, and Lord North's politics. So Christopher Wivell, a retired clergyman, will organize the Yorkshire Association movement. He's also a former member of Parliament. He demanded moderate changes in corrupt parliamentary elections. His corresponding, his movement caused other societies that corresponded to his movement to organize, but the movement will collapse in the early 1780s because of a lack of support. This is not as popular as John Wilkes was, but it will provide protesters with experience, and which will help these political protesters in the next generation of British politics. So in 1782, Parliament will abolish some patronage that the monarch could use. So they're going to go ahead and reform, because even though this movement wasn't that popular, it did signify some resentment on the part of the people. 1783, Lord North will form a ministry with Fox, who was a critic of George III. In 1784, George III will support William Pitt the Younger by giving him a lot of patronage. In other words, giving him a lot of goodies. William Pitt the Younger will head the pro-King George Commons. In 1785, they'll abandon reform after the initial failure of some moderate reform. In the mid-1780s, George III will have reasserted the monarchy, made the monarch stronger in Britain, but then he falls into madness. In fact, a really good movie called The Madness of King George was made about this period of time. And so he's the king, but he's crazy. So obviously this means power will devolve back into Parliament and into the ministers. Popular sovereignty has now become an issue in Europe because of the American Revolution, because some of the political things going on in Britain. Britain will have lost colonies, but trade in America will actually have increased for the British, so it doesn't really affect them too much economically other than the debt to fight the American Revolution. The broader impact of the American Revolution: Americans raised the possibility of government without kings and noble families. They popularized the notion of popular sovereignty and constitutionalism, the idea that you could have a government with a written plan, a written statement to begin with that you had to follow. It's a government that is not based on divine law, tradition, or royal will. The American viewpoint will have changed during the Revolution. At first, they're asserting traditional English liberties. They're arguing their rights as Englishmen. As the American Revolution begins, they ultimately reject the concept of the monarchy, and they embrace republicanism, which is a big shift. They also push the idea of a constitution with a Bill of Rights. And remember, they're focusing on a rejection of nobility and any status based on birth, an argument for equality under the law, and, of course, free trade, which is like the unspoken commandment for American constitutional politics. However, slavery continued. Patriarchy continued. What I mean by patriarchy is male dominance. They also continue to push Native Americans out of territories they control. Still, it is the most free nation that had been created at that point. That was a sophisticated, organized civilization anyway. And these ideas were truly radical and would lead to even more radical change, although it will take decades, centuries, for some of these things to happen. So in perspective, the 16th and 17th century, West European maritime power established colonial mercantile empires. Spain had the largest colonies, but England and France were also in the mix. In the American colonies, slave plantations were a key economic feature. In the 18th century, European warfare over the Americas and India mixed with dynastic wars in Central and Eastern Europe. By the late 18th century, Britain had taken most French colonies, while the weak Spain held on to its colonies a little longer. Austria lost its edge to Prussia. France began amassing debt. Mid-century wars meant European power needed more revenue, and as they tried to get the revenue, it led to American revolutions. The Bourbon reforms in Spanish America increased discontent, which would eventually lead to Spanish colonial revolutions. France did little to deal with their problems of debt, which would eventually lead to the French Revolution. And Prussia, Austria, and Russia would turn to enlightened absolutism, which we'll study more in Chapter 17.